Sherry, thank you so much for joining us here at FundForum International. You've lived and worked in China. What would you say are the opportunities and perhaps the things to be aware of for investment companies looking to that part of the world at the moment?
Thanks, Emma, and thanks for having me here today. I think it's a really interesting time to start thinking about China because on one hand, everyone knows that there's a US and China trade tensions that are happening that are affecting what's happening in the region. But on the other side, you've actually got an amazing opening up that's going on, really stem from the top with Yi Gang, the governor of the People's Bank of China, looking at how it is that international firms can own more of financial services companies within the domestic environment. So the opening up is happening. You've also got some international players that are seeing how they can open up the market. For example, MSCI being able to include Chinese A shares in their index. And very recently, Barclays opening up the bond index and thinking about how Chinese companies and Chinese bonds are being part of that. So I think that at the moment, there's a great opportunity in order to be able to access China. The question is, how is it that fund managers, how is it that investors are wanting exposure to China right now during a time of geopolitical lack of clarity?
You think there is a reticence because of that lack of clarity? Because it is very different to the environment in the US and Europe in terms of regulation, etc., isn't it?
Most definitely, it is certainly very different in terms of regulation, but there are a lot of discussions that China has with regulators around the world. I know in the UK FCA works a lot with sharing views, thinking about best practices with regulators across China. Perhaps that's not as well known, but it certainly is happening. And the Chinese are making changes to their regulatory regime all the time, so there should be some comfort in knowing that they're absorbing what's happening in terms of the rest of the world. But make no doubt, there is a Chinese characteristics that go on there, and so any fund managers or any investors that are looking at China really need to get there, need to understand how it affects them and start thinking about it from an on-the-ground perspective, what it is they're looking to achieve.
Tell me about that, because that was something that came up this morning in the panels, having that local knowledge. How important is it and what have you seen on the ground?
Yeah, I think it's there's no way of replacing it. You really do need to be there. You need to actually communicate with not only policymakers but other peers. And when I talk about peers, it can be other foreign investors who are going in there. We've got some great examples now of wholly owned foreign entities in the asset management space. And how is it that they're faring? What is it that they're meeting resistance to? How is it that they're making some success? How are they finding great talent on the ground? But of course, you have to also make sure that you're paying your time and you're putting your effort in to get to know some of the governments, get to know some of the regulators, and understand a little bit more about the direction and pace of that travel and opening up.
And if you don't do that now, some of these firms are really going to be behind the curve.
You could say that. I mean, obviously there's an argument that says second and third mover advantage might actually be a benefit. As things open up, it may be a point of time where things become easier. At the same time, right now, foreign funds penetrate a tiny amount of the wealth that's in China. There are limitations to how wealth is moving inside and outside of China. Particularly that outflow is very, very limited at the current time. So again, it depends on what your strategy is. If you're looking to go in, raise finance from China and invest in China, now is a fantastic time to be able to get in there. If what you're talking about is thinking about raising funds in China and investing them internationally, there are still quite a few barriers to entry, still needing to be talked through and understood from on the ground perspective. So, my view is to get in to find out what it is that's achievable today.
And also, I suppose, with that in mind, a long-term view perhaps is got to be taken as well.
Most definitely. I mean, when living in China and living in Asia and spending a lot of time, my own personal time there, I have a real appreciation for thinking in decades as opposed to thinking in months. At the same time, I think that we also need to think about how it is that you can start the journey. Because if we're talking about a big investment of thinking and time and planning and strategy, really you should start on the basis of really solid data. And luckily, we're actually seeing a lot more data coming out of China that international investors can use. We at Refinitiv are looking at ways of being able to get that access really easy into all of our systems internationally. And I'd really encourage some of the investors to start thinking about what is the data points that they need to start considering how China works into a portfolio environment, because that's happening now.
Sherry, thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's been great to chat to you this morning.
And you, Emma. Thanks so much.